Hello class, and welcome to lecture 17 of Philosophy 205. In this lecture we start a new unit about the nature of the mind. To start, we're going to discuss a view called dualism, and we'll discuss the mind-body problem. The question we're asking is this: is the mind a distinct entity from the body? Now, very often when we talk about somebody doing something mentally, we talk about they have a good brain or they're using their brain, but is the brain really the same as the mind? Or is there something in addition to the brain, separate from the body entirely, where mental events happen? To get a clearer picture of why this is an interesting question and why this might matter, let's think about what happens when somebody acts, when somebody does something intentionally. To start with, there are going to be background conditions, which include the person's genetics and their environment. So before somebody acts, they always act in a particular situation. They always have a specific genetic code. They're always in a specific environment. So there are conditions that must be met first. But then, it seems like when somebody does something intentionally, there's something that happens in the mind. Their beliefs and desires together combine in a process of deliberation, and they make a choice. And then the choice results in an action. This is how we normally think of intentional action. In a background, you make a decision, and that decision results in an action. But this raises an interesting question. What is the relationship between actions and the body? So first of all, let's set aside the whole process and just focus on the relationship between actions themselves in the body, not choices in the body. So first of all, the body is the thing that actually moves when you perform an action. The body is the thing that actually performs speech. Speech happens through motion of the diaphragm and through the vocal cords, which are parts of the body. And we can say in general, actions are carried out by the body. Even actions that we tend to think of as primarily mental, like writing or speaking, always involve the body. But this leads us to the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is this. It's pretty clear that the mind decides, or at least this is how we normally think of it. But it's also clear that the body acts. When you decide to walk to the store, the decision happens in your mind. You think, I'm going to go to the store. But then your body has to carry out the action. So this raises the question, how are mind and body related? Actions in particular raise this important question, because there's an event in the mind, namely a decision, that somehow affects the body in action. So how does this happen? What's the relationship? Now to start, let's go way back in the history of Western philosophy. Well, fairly far back, to Descartes. Descartes was a French philosopher writing in the 17th century. And according to Descartes, there are two kinds of substance. There's mental substance and physical substance. Now, importantly, according to Descartes, these are completely separate things. Nothing can be both mental and physical. Mental substances are completely mental and not at all physical. Physical substances are completely physical and not at all mental. So your body, obviously, would be a physical substance, whereas your mind would be a mental substance. According to Descartes, the mind is a completely separate entity from the body, and that's where mental events happen. Mental events like decisions happen in the mind. And then if you do make a decision in your mind, that affects the body. So it's a separate entity that, through decision, causes the body to move. Now, what does this mean about the mind and the brain? Well, clearly, if dualism is true, the mind is not the brain. The brain is part of the body. The brain is physical. We know the brain is physical. You can perform an autopsy on someone and remove their brain and weigh it. You can touch it. It's a physical object. This means that the mind is not the same as the brain, assuming dualism is true. So then all these phrases when we talk about using your brain or having a big brain for someone who's intelligent, that's only a metaphor, if this is correct. Either a metaphor or a mistake. So that's the basic view. There are these two separate substances, the mental and the physical. Now, before we start looking at reasons why we might think this is true, let's ask why we should care. Can you think of any reason why we should care whether or not the mind is a physical object? All right, if you didn't come up with any, there are some important reasons why this might be a good question to ask. First, people are concerned about immortality. It seems like immortality requires that the mind is not physical. And if you can't see why, the reason why is our identity and our experience are most closely associated with our mind. Now, if the mind is just the brain or something or a part of the body, it's pretty clear that the body dies and decays. Therefore, if the mind is just part of the brain, then when the body dies, the mind dies too, which seems to mean that we can't be immortal. So if we hope for any kind of afterlife, it looks like we have to hope that the mind is not the brain. We have to hope that the mind is not physical. On the other hand, if the mind is physical, it looks like there's no immortality. Then related to this, there might be various supernatural things that you might care about. And so this could be the existence of ghosts. This could be clairvoyance or telepathy, telekinesis. Any of these supernatural things seem to depend on the mind being more than nature, going beyond nature. In particular, going beyond the physical. If the mind is just physical, then a lot of these things seem impossible. It's not clear how telepathy could happen. It's not clear how clairvoyance could happen. I mean, this is a minor point since I guess most of us don't believe these things are true. But if you hope they might be true, it looks like you have to hope that the mind is not physical. And there's one final point that maybe you didn't think of, but very often people will talk about the emotions and say, well, they're just chemicals. But if the mind is not the brain, then emotions can't be just chemicals. Just to give you a better example of what I'm talking about, people will often say, oh, you think love is this important, amazing thing, but really it's just a bunch of chemicals, a bunch of hormones in the brain that make you feel silly all the time, or whatever people say. So that's the kind of idea that I'm talking about. People try to undermine the value of things like love and caring and compassion by saying it's just a bunch of chemicals in the brain, trying to make it seem like love, which most people think of as the most important thing there is in life, is more or less just like taking drugs. So if that's true, if the mind is something physical and emotions are just chemicals affecting the brain, then that, to a lot of people, that would undermine the value of love. So I'll ask you that question. Do you think that the mind being physical would undermine the value of things like love? Okay. Well, however you answered that, being able to say that the mind isn't physical at all would be another way of getting around this problem. You could respond to them by saying, obviously it's not physical, or obviously these emotions aren't just chemicals because the mind isn't physical at all. These are reasons why you might care about whether the mind is physical. Well, now let's try to argue that the mind is not physical. Is there a way to do it? Descartes proposed a few different arguments in favor of the claim that the mind is not physical. The first one appeals to what's known as Leibniz's law. Leibniz is a philosopher, mathematician, and scientist who also was writing around the 17th century. You might have heard of him because he co-invented calculus, or co-discovered calculus with Isaac Newton. I mean, they didn't work together, but they discovered it about the same time. At any rate, he proposed the following law which relates to identity. The law says, if A has a property that B lacks, then A is not B. So we can think of A and B as different names, and we're wondering, are A and B names for the same thing? Well, if we can find out that the thing named A has a property that the thing named B doesn't, well then A and B can't be names for the same thing. One way to think about this law, it's just pretty obvious when you think of it from a certain point of view. Nothing is different from itself. If you can show that A and B are different, then they can't be the same thing. So for example, you might be wondering if Superman and Jimmy Olsen are the same person. And you might be able to show that Superman is up in the sky right now, but Jimmy Olsen is standing on the ground. So then Superman has a property flying in the sky that Jimmy Olsen lacks. That proves that Superman is not Jimmy Olsen. However, if we try to apply this to Superman and Clark Kent, I mean, we might not initially know that they're the same person, but we'd never be able to find a property that one has and the other doesn't, because Superman and Clark Kent are the same person, just different disguises that they wear. All right, so that's Leibniz's law. Nothing has properties different from itself. But this suggests a strategy for showing that two things are different. If we can find a property that the mind has that the body or brain lacks, then we've shown that they're different things. And Descartes uses this strategy. He tries to find properties that the mind has and the body doesn't, or that the body has and the mind doesn't. And then, since nothing can be different from itself, if they have different properties, they can't be the same thing. He tries to go beyond this and extend this body and brain to mean all physical things. So first of all, let's take a look at the first argument, which relates to doubt. The first argument goes like this. Premise 1, I can doubt that I have a brain. We could extend this premise to say I can doubt that I have a body, or I can doubt that I'm physical at all. Premise 2, I can't doubt that I have a mind. Conclusion, using Leibniz's law, therefore the mind is not the brain. Here, Descartes says, I've found a property that the brain has, or that the physical world has, that the mind doesn't. In particular, the physical world, I can doubt that it exists, but the mind, I can't. So there, doubt, being able to doubt its existence, is the property the physical world has, but the mind doesn't. Therefore, the mind can't be anything to do with the physical world. Okay, now before looking at problems with this argument, let's see how he defends it. Why would he think premise 1 is true, for example? How can I doubt that I have a body? How can I doubt the existence of the physical world? There are a couple different ways to think about this. One, here you would still have a brain, but you wouldn't have a body. So if you're a brain in a vat, being stimulated by a computer to have experiences as if you had a body and you were walking around, then your experiences would be just the same as if you did have a body, but you wouldn't actually have a body. So you might wonder, am I actually just a brain in a vat? I can't tell the difference. It's possible to doubt that I do have a body. Another possibility is that we're disembodied, deceived minds. So maybe the physical world doesn't exist at all. We all exist as disembodied spirits. But A demon is trying to trick us into thinking that a physical world exists. So a demon is putting all these experiences into our minds. And so you might think, how could I tell that this isn't happening? How could I prove that I'm not deceived by a demon? The demon would obviously make it seem like every test I performed showed there was a physical world. So the demon could just keep tricking me. There's no way I can prove I'm not being tricked. So I can doubt that the physical world exists. But on the other hand, why can't you doubt that you have a mind? According to Descartes, you can't doubt that because the very existence of doubt is a mental process. So even thinking about doubt, trying to doubt something, proves that your mind exists. There's no way to coherently doubt that your mind exists. All right, so now we have this argument. There's a property that the external world has, you can doubt that it exists, that your mind doesn't have. You can't doubt that your mind exists. But if they have those different properties, they've got to be different things. So the mind is not physical. That's the argument. Is there a problem with this argument? Well, here's one of the main problems. So first of all, think about whether you've read a book by Eric Blair. So a lot of you probably would say that you haven't, or that you don't know if you have. But have you read any books by F. Scott Fitzgerald? Have you read any books by Virginia Woolf? Have you read any books by J.K. Rowling? Have you read any books by George Orwell? All right, so if you said yes to George Orwell, but no to Eric Blair, you've said contradictory things, because George Orwell is Eric Blair. But if you said no to the first and yes to the second, that means you doubt that you've read a book by Eric Blair, but you don't doubt that you've read a book by George Orwell. Does that prove that Eric Blair is not George Orwell? No, it doesn't. They are the same person. So it turns out it's possible to have doubts about one thing spoken about in a certain way, but not doubt it spoken about in a different way. So all this shows is that there are different names. So the doubts here have to do with whether we know what different names apply to. So it's not really a property of the thing. Whether you can have doubts about something isn't really a property of the thing itself. It's a property of you. So saying you can doubt whether the physical world exists isn't so much a property of the physical world. So Leibniz's law doesn't apply. The fact that you can have inconsistent thoughts about the same thing doesn't mean that the thing itself is inconsistent. So this argument doesn't really work. Let's try another one. This is the argument from divisibility. The argument goes, physical objects have parts in space. So for Descartes, this was basically the definition of physical. To be physical just meant that you were extended in space. Premise 2, the mind does not have parts in space. Conclusion, therefore, the mind is not a physical object. Now, why should we think the second premise is true? According to Descartes, you can figure out everything about the mind just by focusing on your own experience. He thought that it's just the very nature of the mind that it is experienced. So, you can say this. According to Descartes, premise 1, the mind is aware of itself. However, no parts of the mind in space are apparent to the mind. If you focus on your own experience, try to think, where in space is my mind located? You don't really experience your mind as having a certain physical location or physical parts. Therefore, the mind does not have parts in space. So this argument really does depend on this idea that the mind is fully aware of itself. Now, what are some problems with this argument? Here, the property Descartes says that the physical world has, but the mind doesn't, is having parts in space. So if physical things always have parts in space, but the mind doesn't have parts in space, then the mind can't be physical. The problem is, though saying the mind has parts in space sounds odd, that doesn't necessarily mean it's false. We normally don't think of the mind as having parts in space. We don't tend to think of it that way, but that doesn't mean it has to be wrong. And furthermore, perhaps more importantly, it's not clear why the mind should be able to know everything about itself just through reflection. Why should we think that by focusing on our own experience, we can learn everything about the mind? It seems clear that we can be wrong about things about our own mind. So just to give one example, suppose you're looking at a sheet of paper that has a bunch of dots on it. Now, if you're looking at that sheet of paper, your experience of that sheet of paper has an exact number of dots. If Descartes is correct, you should be able to say immediately exactly how many dots are in your experience of that piece of paper. But if it's a lot of dots, say over 100, there's no way you can. You can't just immediately come up with the exact number. So there we've got something that's in our own experience, a bunch of dots, but we can't just say it's this many dots. So there are clearly parts of our own experience that we don't immediately know. And so maybe our mind can have parts in space, even though we don't really experience it that way. So it's not clear that this argument works. Next, there are some other general problems for dualism that don't relate to these arguments that Descartes has given. For example, here's an argument, premise 1, only physical entities have spatial locations. Actions occur in physical locations. Sensations occur in physical locations. Thus, sensations and actions occur in physical entities. Sensations and actions are mental states. Thus, some mental states are physical. Now, even though the words I used are not completely consistent all the way through, which I apologize for, you can see how this argument works. So the premise 1 is basically taking Descartes' premise from the previous argument and using it against him. Saying, all right, so let's go with this, that the only things that can have physical locations are physical things. But actions happen in physical locations, and so do sensations. But sensations in particular are mental events. They're mental states. Being in pain is a mental state. Feeling something is a mental state. So there are mental states that have physical locations, but only physical things have physical locations. So then there are mental states that are physical. And this is enough to show that dualism is false. Because dualism claims that the mental and the physical are completely separate. They can never combine. This argument tries to show that at least things like sensations are both. That undermines dualism. The question is this a good argument against dualism? One way you might respond is to question exactly what it means to say sensations have physical locations. Sensations clearly relate to physical locations. They give you information about physical locations. But can we say that the sensation itself has a physical location? That's not as obvious. So this does pose a problem for dualism, but there might be ways to respond. Next, there's an important question raised by dualism. And this goes right back to the mind-body problem. How can minds cause or be affected by physical events? And how does the physical and non-physical interact? Remember, according to dualism, the physical world and the mental world are completely separate things. And yet, even if we don't say sensations have physical locations, sensations are caused by physical things. Your leg hits the coffee table, you feel pain. So clearly the physical world has caused this mental event of pain. Seeing the world is caused by light from objects hitting our retinas and then being processed by the brain. So how does light hitting our retinas cause visual sensations? If these are completely separate things, how do they interact at all? So this raises an important question. Descartes was careful to say that the mental and physical are completely separate. But if they're really completely separate, it's not clear how they interact. Can you think of any way that you might explain the interaction? I guess before closing the lecture, I'll raise one possibility. One possibility is that there are just fundamental laws about how the physical and the mental interact. The way we're used to talking about fundamental laws of nature, maybe there are some fundamental mental physical laws. So that's a possibility. Is that a good answer? I'll leave that up to you to decide. So to summarize, dualism and the mind-body problem. So the relationship between the mind and body is potentially significant. We've seen that things like immortality and the value of emotions might depend on whether the mind is physical. And it's clear that it's hard to think of the mind as a physical object. The main argument that the mind is not physical is to focus clearly on our own experiences of the mind. And if you think that focusing on your experience tells you what the mind is like, that suggests that the mind is not physical. But there are some problems for the conclusion that the mind is not physical. It raises difficult questions about how the mind interacts with the world. And so, while there are some arguments in favor of it, we will consider other theories of mind and see if they can do a better job explaining what's going on. All right, we'll look at those in the future.